Good, up- good afternoon, sir. So, my name is Daryl Kalasang from BEd 4A, your student in T3 teaching Indigenous people. So, this module composed of or consists of 3 lessons. So, before we start, module 1, Education, Philosophy of Indigenous People. In this module, culture as a process and product, history, life stories, into the tribe story, into the bigger story and the world. Spiritually, expression, faith, life, values, and belief. So, indigenous education involves dimensional tradition such as historical and spiritual tradition, group work, apprenticeship, and high levels of community context. Indigenous education specifically focuses on teaching indigenous knowledge, models, methods, and content within formal or non-formal education and content within growing and use of indigenous education methods can be response to the erosion and loss of indigenous knowledge through the process of colonialism and globalization and modernity. Lesson 1. Culture as a product. Culture is a of, way of life or a group of people, the behavior, beliefs, values, and symbols that they accept generally without thinking about them and that are passed along by communication and imitation from one generation to the next. So, culture is a set of rules for behavior you cannot see. Culture, because you cannot see the rules, you cannot only see the products of culture. In the sense that you can see the behavior the rules produced. Culture is characteristic of groups. The rules of a culture are shared by the group, that not invented by the individual. The rules of the group which are passed on from one generation to the next form to the core of the culture. So, culture is learned. No one is born acculturated. Rather, we are born with a biological capability to learn. What each person learns depends upon the cultural rules of the people who raised them. So, we can say that culture is learned and it was observed. So, individual members of a culture are embedded in different degrees with their culture because culture is learned. It can be well learned by some people in the group and less well learned by others. So the second, culture as a process. So culture as a process, it compresses all procedures through which people transform the world as it is into a world of our own. This includes all group specific norms and values, rules and ideas, information and knowledge as represented, exchanged, appropriated, altered, and created anew in the process of communication. Culture as a product. Culture is also an exchange value, so it is a product, good, service, idea, but one that calls for good, consistent, and shared economic, social, and culture models. Indigenous people are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from which they have been displaced. The land and natural resources on which they depend are inextricably linked to their identities, culture, livelihoods, as well as their physical and spiritual well-being. The indigenous people's experience of education. The consolidated findings reveal that education has other dimension in the indigenous people's experience. So number one, school as a venue of discrimination. Until today, discrimination persists as one of the traumatic experience of indigenous people. So we cannot deny the fact that it is happening right now, that some of the IPs or some indigenous people are being bullied or being discriminated But we are thankful to we are thankful because some of school are practicing the what we call this one, the multiculturalism. So we are thankful with that multiculturalism because of that, teachers or the school are preventing the discrimination of the indigenous student. So school as experience of non-being. Indigenous people who have gone to school recall how their way of life and the indigenous people in general were usually seen as backward and belonging to the past, and their knowledge and skill were discussed as inferior or invalid when compared to modern knowledge and skills. When indigenous people's life and being were discussed, there was a tendency to misrepresent or misinterpret them because of the prevailing prejudice. So, this experience showed the failure of the mainstream education system to address the indigenous community context. These are some common problem experience: misuse and abuse of cultural practices, misappropriation of tribal song, dances, and also symbols, selling of ancestral lands, dying indigenous knowledge system, speaking their own dialect or language, practices such as making their own products. So, lesson 2, life story woven in the tribe, story woven in the bigger of nation and the world. For the past 30 years, a major focus of epis- Episcopal communication on indigenous people has been the struggle of the indigenous community for their ancestral domains and human rights issues, and more recently, in the articulation and assertion for indigenous peoples' education. Education has always been identified priority concern with the indigenous people apostolates, formulating their own programs or intervention depending on the availability of resources and other consideration. So, Indigenous Peoples' Right Act of 1997 promotes, recognize, and protect the rights of every indigenous people which as a citizen to this country also practice. So, we are thankful because the government created this Republic Act of 1997 to promote, and so this right protect the rights of the indigenous people. Well, there are no definite statistic and figures to give the accurate number of indigenous people communities reached by the public system of the country. It is safe to say that schooling is still inaccessible to many of these communities. So, intervention spectrum of needs, basic literacy, numeracy. Form of intervention. Teaching basic literacy, numeracy to children and adults based on mainstream approaches, methods, and content. Periodic trainings, livelihood, health, etc. Provision of adult-based training based on mainstream approaches and content. Support to enter school. Provision of school supplies, scholarship, and tutorials. So schools, provision of infrastructure, personnel, usually lowlander, curriculum, evaluation tools, books, and school calendar based on mainstream education system. Modified intervention. It is in response to the situation, some intervention were modified by contextualizing the context, the lesson, or for avocado instead of apple. Using non-formal methods to facilitate academic learning and achievement, there were also efforts in several dioceses to build dormitories exclusive for indigenous students studying in the towns, ease adjustment difficulties and lessen discriminatory experience. The main goals, however, were still to inculcate mainstream competencies and learning processes to facilitate assimilation of indigenous learners into main society. Education for indigenous people is defined as a comprehensive set of learning process that integrates both indigenous knowledge and other knowledge system. It is education that builds on the people's culture and experience and at the same time trains to be critical and analytic regarding to their situation to enable them to make sound decision and action. Education should go beyond literacy and skill training for livelihood project and ensure that indigenous people are empowered to be able to actively participate in the maintenance or development of adjustment and democratic society where the integrity of their culture and their quest for self-determination are ensured and recognized. So the program, community organization involves building community organization and providing assistance in areas of situational analysis, organizational management, and project management, research and information, updating and validating data on community concern and issues, and disseminating it to the community and broader public. Specific research projects undertaken for use by the community, especially in the field of agriculture, forestry, and natural resource management, appropriate technology, among others. So, the last is education. Some of the topics are human rights and indigenous peoples, including ancestral land issues, environment, cultural conservation, renewal and development, self-determination, gender, and peace building. Socioeconomic assistance to small-scale projects and cooperatives, including management, rehabilitation, including assistance to communities affected by natural calamities or conflicts such as forcible displacement as a result of militarization or development project, community health education promoting traditional medicine and other efficient and inexpensive healing methods, linkage and international relations including networking with different indigenous organizations and individuals in the country and international. So the lesson 3 is spiritually expression of faith, life, values, and belief. So their reason for this belief usually stem from the fact that they often would hear the names of new deities, concept, beliefs, or of a chance, sometimes epic in nature, even after their informant had assured them to divulging all their knowledge. Also, generally, the most respective were often uncooperated with non-initiates. So, belief in Supreme God. In the Philippines, the record of the Spanish and surviving indigenous tradition leave little doubt that the Filipinos had a belief in a supreme creator God. The name of this God varied depending on the region is discussed. Among some of the names are Bathala, Diwata, Kabunian, Mansilatan, Makaptan, Laon, Lumawag, Mamarswa, Tuhan, and etc. Graphs showing the hierarchy of creation generally held in Philippines belief system. So, as we can see, Supreme God, creation, God's benefit, Anitos, lower beings, God's male, female, earthly beings. So, the Creator God was almost always said to be invisible or without form, and as a such image of the deity was not generally made. The Supreme God was seen as distant and too involved in higher matters for direct worship. The lower gods were known by names like Diwata, Diwa, Diwata, Tuhan, and Anito. So in animism, the ancient Filipinos believed, like many animistic peoples, that all objects had spirits or were inhabited by such. Even seemingly inanimate objects like rocks, mountain, lakes, etc. A natural phenomena like wind, thunder, and fire were said to be inhabited by particular spirit or to be governed by certain gods. So, Filipino, we believe that before afterlives, practically All the early Filipinos had a belief in the afterlife. Generally, it was believed the good went to heaven or its Philippine equivalent while the evil went to hell. The very widespread belief that heaven and hell were divided into different levels was also found in the Philippines. So, cosmology, many of the Philippine people viewed the cosmos as consisting of multiple heavens or universe, each without form or boundary. In a way, these were similar to modern concept or dimension. This heaven were not stacked upon the other, although different stacked heaven concept also existed. The other heavens or universe existed in different realities, and those were not though occupying the same space. So spiritually is not subject to be taught, but it is a strand to be woven through the curriculum as a natural part of life. Spiritually, it is not a point of in cognitive development, but is integral to existence. The current prevalent disconnection between education and spirituality result in the disintegrated presence, especially in school where a space needs to be created that allows both teacher and student the opportunity to develop deeper awareness of existence. So I think that would be all. So thank you and good afternoon.